Well, this week is kind of a continuation from last week, our message last week, where we've been learning, and we've been in the book of Exodus. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Exodus chapter 8, I think we're in today. But we've been going through Exodus, where we've been learning about following a faithful God. And as we look at the book of Exodus, Exodus is more than just the story of the deliverance of God's people from Egypt. You know, so many people just say, well, it's a book of deliverance. Well, it's about more than that. You see, in addition to delivering God's people from slavery, the book of Exodus is also about bringing God's people back to himself, back to that place of worship. So we kind of have to remember that and ready to follow. And in this book, God is revealed for who he is over and over again as a God worth following. So last week, we kind of turned a corner in the way God has been working in Exodus as he called Moses and Aaron to go back to Pharaoh, say, let my people go. And he says, if you don't let them go, I'm going to send plagues, or I'm going to demonstrate my power through judgments against you, right? And show his power with these plagues. And these plagues aren't just judgment or justice against Egypt and against Pharaoh, but they're also a means of revealing himself, for God to reveal himself for who he is, a God who's powerful, a God who is good, a God who is over all things, even all the gods of Egypt. And he's a God worth following. So our scripture that we read at the start that Chris read kind of highlights this purpose of all these plagues and why God would send these awful, and as we start to read them, we say, man, this is horrible things happening, but there's a purpose to it. And here's, again, kind of recap and what Chris had read. It says, for this time, God says, I will send all my plagues on you yourself and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Isn't that awesome? There is no God like our God. And each of these plagues kind of defeat one of the gods of Egypt and are kind of addressing one of the gods of Egypt that the people were trusting in, that the Egyptians were trusting in. And then he goes on and says, for by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth, or I could have just killed you. But for this purpose I've raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. Isn't that awesome? So God's name will be proclaimed even through these plagues. Now, we looked at the first 3 plagues last week, right? Where he turned the Nile River to blood, where he brought frogs everywhere, and then gnats, right? And it was this last plague of gnats that actually Pharaoh's own magician said, no, we can't even copy that one. In fact, they attribute it, they even start to come around and start to see the power of God, and they say, we think this is the finger of God, Pharaoh. Something bigger is going on than just these guys coming in doing magic tricks. This might be the finger of God. And yet, Pharaoh still kind of ignores what's going on, and he kind of gets stubborn and refuses to release the people, right? So these plagues, as we looked at last week, they were all-encompassing. They affected everybody. They were disruptive in that, you know, God's power disrupts our plans and our will. And then they were also hard to ignore. I mean, you couldn't get past that something big is going on. And building off of that this week, you know, we have the plagues we're going to look at today. But here's a big truth, and we kind of closed our message last week with this. You know, the demonstration of God's power either is going to drive us away from God, further away from God, or it's going to draw us close to God. And we see over and over again through these plagues, it drives Pharaoh further away from God, but it draws people like Moses and Aaron, and eventually the people of Israel, closer to God. And again, Exodus is about more than just deliverance. It's about bringing God's people to him. So that's kind of what we're looking at this. So we're going to kind of go through these plagues. We're going to do 6 more plagues today. So we're going to move quite a bit and go through these plagues. But I want you to understand what these plagues are about, why God sends these plagues, and what the effects of these plagues are before we start to look at what really this means for us with God's power as we're continuing to learn about God's power. So today's going to kind of be a little faster going through some of these plagues. So we have the 4th plague comes. Okay, so God sends this plague of gnats, and Pharaoh digs his heels in and says, nope, you can't go, right? Now we're in the middle of chapter 8. And like the first plague that God sends, he sends Aaron and Moses to Pharaoh in the morning to give a warning of this plague. And Pharaoh's at the Nile River washing, and they go to him, and they say, if you don't let God's people go, he's going to send another plague. And this time, it's kind of even worse than the gnat you just had, but it's still a bunch of pests. See, God's going to bring a plague of flies. And he says flies are going to swarm the earth everywhere, right? And most people believe the flies that came to Egypt in this plague are something called the dog fly. I don't know if it's kind of like the horse fly or anything like that, but when I read a description of what it does, it kind of reminds me of those, if you've ever been down to the beach on a day where there's no wind, you know, either on a Delaware Bay or Brigantine or something, and you get the flies and they bite your ankles all day. You know those flies? That's what these dog flies. So they're blood-sucking flies that bite hard and leave a welt. But they swarm all over everyone. They fill up every house, and they're all over every person and every beast. And he says, this is what I'm going to send to you. And he tells Moses, I want you to go tell Pharaoh, this is coming tomorrow. And this is interesting because a lot of these plagues are given a warning, and then he said, but it's going to come tomorrow. And one of the reasons God's doing that is he wants Pharaoh to think about this. He wants it to sink in. This is coming. You can't stop it. But you still have a chance to come around. So God, in a way, is showing his mercy through this. So anyway, God sends this plague. And one of the interesting things about this plague of flies that's different from the first three, as this plague does not affect the Israelites who are in the land of Egypt. In fact, look at verse 22 of chapter 8. It says, but on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen. Remember, the land of Goshen is where the Israelites live, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen. So this is kind of wild. He sends so many flies that it fills the sky, fills everything, but it's almost like it's got a screen porch around Goshen, or a canopy of protection around his people, and said it's only going to affect, I don't know if you lived on the border of Goshen and you have all these flies and then you walk through and there's nothing. I don't know how it worked, but it's kind of wild, isn't it? So God protects his people. And he says, the reason I'm doing this is so that you know I am the Lord in the midst of the earth, or I'm the Lord of the earth, and I can work in amazing, powerful ways, not just to send calamity, but I can work in even little details like this. And what happens is this plague is really targeted against one of Egypt's gods, named Khepri. Khepri is the god of creation and the earth. And Khepri was all the pictures of Khepri have him as a head of a person's body with the head of a fly. So that's why flies kind of were sent against this. But the result of this plague that comes against Egypt, it says the land is ruined. And I'm not really sure what that means, just that the land is ruined. And people are miserable because they have welts all over them that are even worse than the gnats. So what happens with this is Pharaoh comes back to Moses and Aaron and says, hey, I'll tell you what. I know I said I won't let you go, but I'm going to let you go and sacrifice to your God, but you can do it here in Goshen. So just go and sacrifice to your God in Goshen. And Moses is like, no, that's not good enough. He goes, all right, then just do it. You can do it out in the wilderness, but in the wilderness of Egypt. So don't leave Egypt. Just you can do it out there. So he's trying to compromise, right? And trying to find a way where he doesn't have to really do what God says and still kind of keep some control or get a win for himself. But here's one point. You know, with God, there's no compromising. If God says, this is my way, then this is his way. That's why Jesus said, you know, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. There's no compromise in that. Just like there's no compromise in this. When God says, let my people go, he means go. So, but anyway, Moses then asked God for the flies to stop, and the flies stop. But it says Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he refuses to let the people go. So that's the plague of the flies. They're back to where they began before that plague, though. So then God says, and this is in chapter 9, he expands the demonstration of his power. And remember, he'd already destroyed their bounty from the Nile. All that comes from the Nile, the fish and all that died and all of that, right? Now he overwhelms their animals, their meat, and everything with that. So what he does is he asks Aaron and Moses to go to Pharaoh back at the palace, just like in the second plague, and ask to be freed. And he said, if you don't free God's people, there's going to be a plague or pestilence on your livestock. They're going to get disease. And then they talk about this livestock, and they said, basically, your horses, donkeys, and camels, you know what that's doing? That's destroying all their transportation. They used horses to go from place to place, and war and chariots and things like that. They used donkeys to carry things and to plow fields and things, and then they used camels for travel and things. So he says, so basically, all of your means of travel are going to be, and work are going to be destroyed. But not only that, also your herds and flocks. So all of your clothing and food, everything you rely on for that is going to be gone as well. All of it will die. But once again, he says, but Israel will be spared of this in the land of Goshen. They won't have this happen against all of their animals. And it's interesting because this is the first plague that we have that actually is against the property of Egypt. So it really starts to hurt. It's less of an annoyance and more of a destruction or a cost to it. So God says, I'm going to send this pestilence that's going to come and kill all your animals, your cattle, your work animals. And this defeats and humiliates another god of Egypt, actually a goddess of Egypt called Hathor, who is the goddess of love and protection, but she's pictured with the head of a cow. Must be a beautiful woman. Anyway, so we have this Hathor, and it defeats that. Another one of Egypt's god is down and shows that they're powerless against God. And God says it's going to come tomorrow. And just as he does it, it says, verse 6 of chapter 9, and the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. Isn't that cool? So the only ones in Egypt now with any animals are the Israelites, as far as work animals and things like that. So what's interesting about that, and I started to think about that, so now the Egyptians are probably having to come to the Israelites if they need to work their fields or they need to have some food or some meat or something. They're coming to the Israelites and they're having to buy their livestock, which is kind of cool because remember when God said he's going to enrich the Israelites? They would plunder Egypt and start to get back. This possibly is one of the ways he's blessing Egypt. Anyway, as a result of this plague, guess what? Pharaoh didn't smarten up. It says his heart was hardened again, and he refused to let the people go. So now comes another plague. And just like the third plague, this sixth plague comes without warning. There's no, hey, if you let God, you better let God's people go or else. None of that. Basically what God tells Moses and Aaron to do, look at verse 8. It says, take handfuls of soot from the kiln, or take handfuls of ash, and let Moses throw them into the air in the sight of Pharaoh, and it shall become fine dust over the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all of the land of Egypt. So there's it's this picture of coming out, and it's like coming down like ash coming down over them, and just covering them in boils. Painful. Have you ever had a boil? A sore that kind of opens up and it just kind of nasty, right? And it breaks out all over the people and all over their remaining animals. So even like their pet dogs and things like that. It gets all over all of that. So much so, they were painful to the point that it said people couldn't even work. They couldn't do anything. In fact, even Pharaoh's magicians couldn't even come and see Moses. When Pharaoh came to see Moses, they're in so much pain. And these magicians, remember, these were the guys that were thinking they were big stuff, being able to do magic tricks and copy some of this power of God. They're down for the count on this. They're defeated. And they can't come and stand before Moses. As well as, there's two Egyptian gods that this kind of goes against. The first is the goddess Isis. Have you ever heard of Isis? She's the goddess of health. And then you had Imhotep, who's the god of medicine. And the Egyptians, they were famed for their cleanliness. And here with all these boils, they can't even clean themselves or do anything to take care of themselves. And it was something that they were into, and they couldn't even do it. So it's really hitting them where it hurts the most for them. But yet it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to let the people. This was just as God had promised. Remember, God had promised Moses, hey, I'm going to keep sending these plagues, but Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. I'm going to harden it, and it's going to be hardened because, I want my name to be proclaimed over all the earth. I want to show myself to him who I am, but also to Israel, so they will see that I am a God worth following, a powerful God. And then we start this final series of 3 plagues. Remember, these plagues are kind of in sets of 3. And this is a nasty one because he tells Aaron and Moses to go back to Pharaoh, ask to be released. If not, there's another plague. And this is where we had our passage where God explains the purpose of all these plagues and said, Pharaoh, I raised you up for this purpose. You know, this is why I did this, to show I'm the God over, you think you've achieved everything? I'm over even you and your purposes. I placed you where you are. God is over all these things. And he says, as a result of this, here's what's going to happen. Hail is going to fall that had never been seen since and never before or since this bad. Okay? He says hail is going to fall and it's going to destroy everything. But it's interesting, in this plague, there's an out. There's a little small window or path they could take where it wouldn't affect them. Now, it wasn't going to affect the Israelites, but he says in verse 19, he says, now therefore get your livestock, the livestock you have left that hasn't died or that you might have bought from the Israelites, and all that you have in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. So he says, hey, there's a way you can avoid this. Get all this stuff and bring it inside. And he says, those who feared God brought their people and livestock in, and those who didn't fear God did not. And he says, this is coming tomorrow. And Moses raised his hand to the sky, and you know what happened? Thunder starts crashing. And then it said fire fell from the sky and hail. So fire and ice fell from the sky. Fire, lightning comes and starts striking everywhere, right? Just blowing things up. And then hail comes. These big ice balls start coming and destroying everything, hitting people, car windshield, if you've ever had that happen, and hitting animals and all the crops and trees. It's taking down trees and all their crops that are in the field start getting destroyed. And again, it didn't happen in the land of Goshen. So imagine this canopy around this. Again, this little hole where there's no storms happening, but everywhere else are just these heavy storms. And it later says that, the crops that were destroyed were all their flax and barley was destroyed. But their wheat wasn't utterly destroyed by this hail because it wasn't quite ripe yet. So they still had a little wheat, so they had a little hope, and that's important a little bit later. Pharaoh sees this happen and something huge happens. Pharaoh confesses his sin. He says, tell God I'm sorry that I've sinned against him. Tell your God. Remember when Pharaoh was saying, who is this God? I've never heard of him. Now Pharaoh's like, no, I'm sorry. Tell him I'm sorry for doing wrong against him. And have him stop this hail. Now it's important to realize that just because you confess your sin, that's not the same thing as repentance. Being sorry for sin isn't the same as repentance. It's just like if you got caught for doing something wrong. Remember when you were a kid and your mom was like, say you're sorry, and you're like, sorry. And you didn't really mean it. Well, here, he's sorry that he's got caught, sorry that he did these things about God, but it didn't lead to any change in actions or any trusting in God for it. So he just wants God to relent, wants him to stop, right? So, and he actually promises, he says, you know what, Moses, I'll let the people go. If you make this stop, I'll let the people go. And again, this is another god of Israel, God called Nut, or goddess called Nut, or Nut, who's the goddess of the sky and storms. And God overwhelms that and causes this to happen. And then when Moses prays, God stops the thunder and the hail. And as soon as that trouble is gone, guess what Pharaoh does? He repents and starts following God and becomes a great man of God. No, that doesn't happen. You know what happens? He says, you know what, on second thought, this isn't so bad, so I'm not letting your people go. No way. And he reneges on his promise once again. So God sent another plague. And he says, all right, and this is in chapter 10. sends Moses to Pharaoh and says, remind him that his heart is hardened, and says, basically ask him, why are you not humbling yourself? Haven't you got this yet? Right? And he says, and then God tells Moses, in addition to me showing Pharaoh my power, I want you to remember my power and tell it to your sons and your grandsons, these great things that I have done for you. So they confront Pharaoh again. They said, how long are you going to refuse to humble yourself and let the people go? And it's kind of not a question that needs to be answered, because Pharaoh is going to keep stubborn. So they said, you know what God's going to do? He's going to send locusts. A plague of locusts that no one had ever seen before and that no one would ever see since. In fact, they're going to cover the face of the earth, and they're going to cover the air, so it's going to be, you won't even be able to see. This is how bad it's going to be. And they are going to eat whatever the hail didn't destroy. So all these crops, even the wheat that's unripened, they're going to eat it all. And every green leaf, there's going to be no green leaf left. Okay? So this is what happens, right? So they say this is going to happen. And then Moses and Aaron leave, and they say it's going to happen tomorrow. After they leave, Pharaoh's servants come back to Pharaoh because they're beginning to lose faith in him. So this is an interesting thing with the plague. Remember how God had told Moses at the burning bush that the people of Egypt are going to send you out, and they're going to give you things to help you go. And they're going to be on your side almost, saying, get out, but here's a blessing to go out. And he changed their hearts, and he's starting to change their hearts so that Pharaoh has less and less support. And his own servants, here's what they say to him in verse 7. How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not understand that Egypt is ruined? They're like, don't you get this? Egypt is already ruined. We have nothing. Just at least let the men go. If you're scared that they're going to raise up an army, just let them go then. So he brings back Moses and Aaron, and he says, when you say let the people go, who do you mean by the people? And Moses said, everybody. And he says, well, no, that's not going to happen. You can let all the men go. I'll let all the men go. But the kids and women and all that, they can't go. And Moses said, sorry, that doesn't work that way. So then Moses goes and he prays to God, right? And he raises his hands over the land. And it said that night God brought an east wind. And the next morning that east wind brought in these locusts. And they came over all of Egypt except Goshen again. But they come over all of Egypt and they eat everything. Eating all the remaining plants and every green leaf. Now think about this. Egypt now has nothing. They have no livestock. They have no crops. The Nile River has dead fish in it. Okay? You remember 400 years ago when Egypt was the world's superpower? And who did they have in charge of that? Second to Pharaoh was Joseph, right? A man who loved God. God's man. And God blessed Egypt. And it said that Egypt had so much bounty that they put all of their grain in storehouses and they fed the world through a famine. The whole world would come to them for all of this grain during a 7-year famine. That's how great Egypt was. Now we see the opposite. When you're not after God's heart, look what happens. They're utterly ruined. Wow. What a turnaround, huh? So we kind of have this, and they're brought to nothing. They have no animals. They have no meat, and now they have no agriculture. It basically ruins the country economically. So how does Egypt have any power anymore? It also defeats another god, Osiris, that's the name, Osiris, who is the god of crops. So they would pray to Osiris for their crops. And again, Pharaoh comes to Moses and Aaron, and he confesses his sin. And he says, no, now this time I really sinned. So please, have God forgive me of my sin just this one time. Right? And he begs Moses for God to take away the locusts. So Moses says, all right. And God caused a west wind to happen, and it drove out every locust from the land. Yet again, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he doesn't let the people go. So here comes this last plague before the big one, okay? And this plague, as chapter 10 closes, is given again without warning. And as the land sits in ruins, here's what God does. He says, darkness is going to fall upon Egypt. It's going to be so dark that it can be felt. Have you ever been in dark? Now, we live on the East Coast. Nothing ever is dark here, right? But have you ever been out in the middle of nowhere and it's just dark? You know, you ever been out in the woods and it's dark and you see no light, no stars, no nothing? Do you ever feel the darkness and it just feels like it's closing in? And it's terrifying, isn't it? He says, they're actually going to feel this darkness. And it's terrifying and it's demoralizing. And here's what happens. So Moses stretched out his hand, verse 22, and it says, toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel, they had light where they lived. Okay? So again, the Israelites have light. So this is a little oasis in the middle of darkness that God has. But you know what? Even the candles that the Egyptians would light in their house couldn't penetrate the darkness. This is how dark it is. They're trying to get light. So all they could do was just sit still. Again, when you're in that kind of darkness, you don't want to move, do you? Because you're afraid you're going to knock into it. So you just sit there. And they sat there for 3 days in utter terror. I think it's interesting that it was darkness for 3 days. You know, and kind of thought about that. You know, Jesus was in the tomb in darkness in 3 days, and then, but the day of victory would soon come. And here at this last plague before the big one, where the day of victory is coming, the day of deliverance and salvation for the Israelites are coming after the darkness. And this is kind of what we have here with this darkness coming. And Egypt's most revered god, one of their main gods, was the god Ra. Have you ever heard Ra? Ra is the sun god. He was one of the main gods of Egypt. And this darkness just kind of puts Ra to shame. So God's saying, I'm even over this. Anyway, Pharaoh is still trying to bargain with Moses. He says, all right, I got to let the people go in some way or shape or form. So he goes to Moses and says, all right, Moses, the people can go, but leave the livestock. You know why he's saying that? First, he doesn't want Israelites to have anything with them, but they need assets. They have nothing, right? So at least if they had livestock, they could start again. They'd have food and they'd have ways to do their crops and things like that. So he says, leave the livestock. But Moses says, nope, we need our animals. We need to sacrifice. We need our animals to sacrifice to God and to carry us out there. So no, we can't leave without them. So the response was Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. He refuses to let the people go. But then he takes it a step further and he says to Moses, he says, you know what, Moses? I've had it with you. In fact, go and leave here. I don't want to see your face again. If I see your face again, I'm going to kill you. Here's what Moses says at the end of chapter 10. Moses said, as you say, I will not see your face again. Moses basically, you're right. You're never going to see my face again. You're about to reap the whirlwind, buddy. You know, it's going to come to a head now. And that's what we're going to find next week with our last plague that we look at. But here, God, he's not letting up the pressure. And hopefully you're getting this by looking at these plagues. That God is not letting up this pressure against Pharaoh and against Egypt. These plagues just wear on and they get worse and worse, right? And again, there's one more that we'll look at next week. But I want to recap these 6 plagues from this week. These flies and the livestock dying, and the boils, and the hail, and the locust, and this darkness, right? Because like the ones that we looked at last week, these plagues teach us something about God's power. It teaches us something about God through his power, through his use of power. Again, it's this power that will either drive us away from God, or it will draw us to God. And here it's starting to draw the Israelites more to God, and it's starting to drive Pharaoh further away from God. And even he's starting to lose his power among his own people. So here's what we learned this week as we put this together and what we can learn from these plagues, besides that it's pretty terrifying if you go against God. But here's some of the things we learned. First of all, these next 6 plagues that we look at, they teach us that God's power is first and foremost, it's particular. Do you know that God's power is particular? Again, we see this happen, right? His power, it's all-encompassing and it can affect everything, but his power he can control. And he can pinpoint his power to be powerful against certain things and to spare other things. And we see this because these plagues affect Egypt, but they don't affect Israel. in the land of Egypt. And some of these plagues, it just can't happen. How are you going to have flies that come up to a point and not stop unless there's a screen door there? Well, God is that screen door. His power is like, I am going to be particular, that this is going to affect everybody else but my people. And that's huge, right? They brought destruction to Egypt. They didn't touch or affect the Israelites. And just think about how crazy that is, you know? These storms that could affect and just are cut off in a line where no hail falls on Israel. It had to be maddening for the Egyptians to watch this. And they're just like, this is so awful. And then they look over there and they're like, but they're out in the sun. They're out getting a tan. They're out enjoying stuff. They're not getting anything destroyed. Something's going on here. So it had to be maddening to them and chipping away their trust at Pharaoh, but also all their gods again. And they're also starting to envy Israel a little bit and say, man, maybe these guys have something. Maybe their God has something. But it would also be very awesome for Israel, right? Because they're saying, man, God is mighty, but God's love for us, it actually works. When God says he loves us, he actually shows it. Because God was mighty to do judgment to others, but to give salvation for us. Wow. See, God is merciful and he's gracious. He's powerful enough to spare his own people from harm, even when it looks like everything else is going on around us that will never be spared. This is pretty applicable today, isn't it? We see things coming on around us. We see things happening in our world, and we're just like, oh no, what's going to happen? We're going to be ruined. But God is with us. God's bigger than all of that. And just because certain things affect some people doesn't mean it's going to affect us. It may, and God may bring us through things to use us, but God can also work, and he's bigger than any power of evil, and he's able to accomplish what he desires with great precision. And God can do that in our lives as well. In fact, the psalmist in Psalm 129 talks about this. He says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth, who's over all things, basically. He will not let your foot be moved. So you're seeing God is over heaven and earth, but yet even my foot he takes care of and will make sure I won't even slip. He who keeps me will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is the shade at your right hand. He's our power. And the psalmist is talking about this with Israel, but also God's people, and we're God's people. So to look at what God can be for us, that God isn't going to slumber. And even though everything else may seem in chaos, things aren't chaotic for God. And he'll say, I can calm your storm in your life by letting you know I'm in control. Nothing is going to happen to you that I won't allow. Because God's power is particular. And he's got us. Isn't that awesome? See, God is powerful and particular God. But we also find in these plagues that God's power is also purposeful. And we look at these plagues that God's power always has a purpose. God doesn't do anything just randomly. And even all of this power that he did is against all of their gods. It's for a purpose. And we read about the purpose, that we may know the name of God and that there's none like God. I always have a question when I look at this. And I don't know why it doesn't dawn on the Egyptians. They have all these gods, right? They have a God for this, a God for this, a God for this, a God for this. So none of their gods are all powerful. They just are powerful over a certain thing. Israel's got one God who's powerful over everything. Look how that works. Isn't God trying to say something with that? Yeah, I'm over everything for you. So God displayed his power so it would be known of all the earth. In fact, guess what? When in the book of Joshua, when we go through Joshua, we'll see this. When Joshua sent spies into Jericho and they go with Rahab, and they're hiding with Rahab, Rahab says, I know about this God, and I know about you, and I know about the great signs and power that God displayed while you were in Egypt. Isn't that cool? That's years and years later, and he says, we've heard about it up here, of God's power. Why? So God's name will be proclaimed through all the earth. And that's dread for some, but for those who trust God, it's an awesome encouragement. that God's going to achieve his purposes, and he's powerful enough to achieve his purpose in our life. You know, God was achieving his purpose with Egypt because Pharaoh was forced to admit God's power, and his servants are begging him, and his power is getting eroded, and all of these things. But Moses and Aaron, they were getting more emboldened. They were like standing up to Pharaoh. Remember when Moses first went and he says, oh, I haven't heard of this God, and let my people go? And Moses is like, okay. And then they go back and said, it didn't work. God, why didn't you let this work? Now they're like, no way, man. If you're just going to send our men, we're not going. We want everybody. And you know what? You don't want our animals going? Guess what? We have to have our animals. So no. And then Pharaoh says at the end, right? He says, no, I don't want to see your face again. And Moses is like, don't worry, you're not going to see my face again. Why? Because Moses is getting emboldened here. He's like, no, because my God can do anything. And he's seen God do this in his purposes. It kind of brings me back to Romans, where Paul's saying, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. All things are going to work together for good, or we're going to see God working his purposes. So we're going to find it as encouragement to God if we love him, because we say, even though we may have to go through things that aren't as great, we still know that God will win and God is achieving his purposes. So guess what? It's going to be for good. Whenever God displays his power, it's to bring about his purpose, so that he can have his name proclaimed, so that he can be known, so that he can be worshipped. So we grasp God's purpose when his power draws us closer to him. Now, until that point, until we're drawn closer to him, however, God's not going to stop bringing us to the point of recognizing him, that he's God and we're not. God is going to keep pounding that point home. And in that, we learn one more thing, that God's power is persistent. Over and over again, God will keep bringing these plagues as long as Pharaoh keeps being hardened, or he keeps hardening God. As long as God isn't able to be seen there by them and recognized, God's going to take them to their knees. Why? Because God won't stop. God won't stop till he accomplishes what he needs to accomplish. These plagues, they get progressively worse. And you know what? This is sometimes how God works with us. When God wants to take us somewhere, when God wants to call us somewhere, and we start to run away from that, guess what? God's going to send up roadblocks, and they're going to start small. Might be a person saying, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. But then you know what's going to start happening? God's going to start turning us. We see this. We see God doing this with Pharaoh. We also see God doing it in the book of Judges, when the people keep falling away, and God keeps sending people to go and defeat them, so they'll cry out for him and come back to him. We see this with Jonah. Remember Jonah, when we went through Jonah? And he said, I want you to go to Nineveh. And he hops on a ship, right? And God's like, you shouldn't do that. And then he sends a storm. And then after the storm, he sends a whale or a great fish and swallows him up. And then he spits him up on land. And then Jonah's like, all right, I'll go. And then he goes, and he's like, I'm still not convinced. And then he sends the tree and show that God's in control and he can do whatever he wants. And Jonah's finally starting to wake up to it. Why? Because God's not going to stop until we get it. That can be fearful, can't it? To say God's not going to stop, God's not going to relent in my life. But it's also an encouragement to say God's never going to give up on us. God's never going to stop working in us and through us to accomplish what he wants for us. In fact, Paul talks about that in Philippians. He says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. Guess what? God is not going to stop working in us and in our lives. He's not going to stop showing his power for us. So like with the plagues, God's not going to give up on us. He will not let up until he accomplishes his purposes. So that's an awesome promise, isn't it? And it's an awesome thing that we see through these plagues, even though they're horrible and all of this, that God is particular in his power, that he can work, but yet, even though everything may seem falling apart, God says, but I still have you. And I'm still bigger, and I'm still have you right where I need you to be. You're not going to be utterly destroyed. I'm not going to let you. And God is purposeful. And he says, I'm going to achieve my purposes. Don't worry. I'll do whatever I need to do to get my purposes. In fact, I'll do it as long as it takes. So I'll be persistent in it. And I will not give up until it's completed. And that's an amazing promise. And as we see this, and they're awful in their scope, destructive in their power, and judgment for Egypt, but encouraging for Israel. And it should be encouraging for us that God can work in power like this And it's one God over all. None are like our God. No person, no people, no God or gods are like our God. He is the one true God. You know, for those who choose to fight against him, again, it can be a painful, harsh lesson. However, those that cling to him, those that when we're drawn to him, guess what we find? We find a God worth following because it's a God powerful enough to take care of us, to use us, and to never give up on us. And it's all that we need to follow him better in our world today, at work, tomorrow, or at school, or as we go from this place. So, what's our takeaway? Let's continue to draw close to a powerful and mighty God. And next week, we're going to see this amazing picture that this last plague, which is the worst one of all, as far as being awful, but it's also the most beautiful because in it, God gives us a picture of Jesus for us. And we're going to look at that next week as we look at the Feast of the Passover and how the Feast of Passover came to be. And it was because of this 10th plague. But until that, cling to God and his power for us. Let's pray.